It's working. Okay. So, welcome. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the third conversation in the Sawyer Seminar Series, which, funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, will continue to meet until June 2013. So we'll have many more of these great events. Many of you know it already, but it's worth repeating that this seminar was made possible by several people here at UC Davis, people and units at UC Davis. Crucial to this effort have been the Davis Humanities Center and its previous director, Carolyn de la Peña, the Center for Science and Innovation Studies, and Mario Biagioli, and Science and Technology Studies, and Joe Dummett. The Department of Anthropology, its staff, and my colleagues have been very supportive as well. Magali Rabasa, wonder organizer, makes possible everything that happens here, including the microphone working. Cristiana Giordano, Joe Dummett, Mario Blaser, and I teach together a weekly graduate seminar, the Sawyer Seminar. We're greatly enjoying our time in class together, and this is to a large degree the making of those who participate in the seminar as students. They deserve a very special mention for their enthusiasm, creativity, and hospitable relationship with the laborious text that we work with. Thanks go to you all. Raise your hands. Thanks very much. Okay, that was the acknowledgments. You are all here today to participate in a conversation with Marilyn Strathern and Donna Haraway. They have been sources of inspiration for our Sawyer Seminar since we started thinking about it. The title of the seminar, Indigenous Cosmopolitis, Dialogues for the Reconstitution of Worlds, also reveals the presence of Isabel Stengers in our thinking. Strathern and Haraway do not need a long introduction. You're all familiar with them and their work. As scholars of anthropology, science studies, and feminism, they have been game changers from their first to their most recently published books. Donna's first book was Crystals, Fabrics, and Fields, Metaphors That Shape Embryos. It was published in 1976. Her most recent book is When Species Meet, published in 2008. Marilyn's first book was Women in Between. Written in 1972, she considered it timid and unorthodox. Those were her words. When she unwrote it, also her words, it became The Gender of the Gift, which was published in 1988. Her last book, published in 2005, is Kinship, Law, and the Unexpected. Relatives Are Always a Surprise. And in between, she also unwrote, again, her word, Kinship at the Core, an anthropology of Eldon, a village in northwest Essex in the 1960s, which she had written in 1981. When she wrote it again, it became After Nature, English Kinship in the late 20th century, published in 1992. Marilyn and Donna have been in scholarly conversation with each other for a long time. From my readings of their works, probably since the late 1980s, the early years of post-colonial studies. For example, in her article, Gender for a Marxist Dictionary, an example of their conversation, published in 1991 in Siemens, Cyborgs, and Women, Donna found explosive material in Marilyn's 1988 Gender of the Gift to explain that our idea that only women can be mothers was not a biological but rather a cultural fact. In Melanesia, and most specifically in Hagen, men could be mothers, and mothers were made by their children as much as children could be made by their mothers. Reciprocally, Strathern's partial connections is strongly inspired by Haraway's situated knowledges in the Cyborg Manifesto. Being partially connected, it is what cyborgian objectively situated knowledges are. They are inspired by each other's phrases. Marilyn quotes Donna, "One story is not as good as another." And Donna quotes Marilyn, "It is important what ideas we use to explain other ideas with." As these mutual quotes show, they care about the words and the grammar they write with. Donna invents, tweaks, joins words to make concepts. Some of them, like material semiotic and nature cultures, have become common sense, or sort of, at least in academia. Others are still neologisms, like terrapolis and humanimo, for example. Marilyn's descriptive philosophy requires that she alter the grammar we are used to. Her sentences may not have a comfortable structure consisting of subject, verb, and predicate. The grammatical person that she uses in writing is also unusual. Neither the phenomenological I nor the objectivist they. Eduardo Viveiros de Castro says that Marilyn has invented a kind of non-dialogic second person, a complex variation of free indirect speech. If, as Donna said, grammar is politics by other means, the writing practice of these two scholars has the capacity to alter our understanding of politics. Partially connecting all these fields, anthropology, feminism, and science studies, and playing the game of cat's cradle with each other, they have created academic room for generative indiscipline to which we may all be invited, provided that we're willing to play and become with all other persons that enter the field: yams, shells, dogs, pigs, ancestors, embryos, wombats, and humans. We invited them here today to continue their conversation in public and with us. The dynamic will be as follows. Marilyn will talk to us for about 50 minutes, and then Donna will join in the conversation and talk with Marilyn and us for 20 to half an hour. We are not going to look at our watches and tell them to stop. We're not doing that today. And then we can all join in the conversation. So please, let's welcome Marilyn and Donna.
Thank you so much. You want me to do this, do you?
You're fine, yes.
Is this,
you have to.
Is this sleeping?
Yes, that's fine. Okay, let's do it here. I think here, that's better.
Okay, I believe you.
And that's just for the recording, yes. So, yeah, turn it on. And you hold these. Perfect.
Do I hold this as well?
Yes, you have to hold both. Oops.
So,
Okay, it's fine.
shall I speak into this as well?
Yes. This doesn't make any noise. The only noise is for the recording.
Thank you. Professor de la Cadenier, members of the Sawyer Seminar, and colleagues, first I must thank you for your words and the introduction. That was delightful. I enormously appreciate this opportunity to participate in your dialogues on the Reconstitution of Worlds. The topics you've suggested touch us all, and for my part, not least the very first, comparing relations and relational worlds. What you lay out in your rubric already gives us a platform from which to work. I want to experiment not just with the idea of diverse relational modes, but with alternatives to the concept of relation as such. But the problem is it may work or it may not work. However, that's the end point. The starting point is politics. And that little preamble was just to get you used to my accent, for which I suspect I should apologize. Less than 3 months ago saw the launch of the European Consortium for Pacific Studies, ECOPAS, a triangulation of institutions and disciplines from Fiji, Papua New Guinea, the Netherlands, Norway, and the UK, as well as the EU Commission. Its focus is climate change. The hope is for scholarly collaboration in developing long-term strategies for social science and the humanities in the arena of research on the Pacific. Its origins lay in an occasion when a round table of Pacific Island academics had urged their colleagues, and I'm quoting, to recognize the responsibilities to oceanic peoples, to the academy, and to civil society that comes with the exchange of expert knowledge. There's a history here, of course, which, globally speaking, began building up in the 1900s, and 2 decades later is as significant as ever. The shame is that such consciousness does indeed have a long history. The Pacific Island scholars were expressing frustration that for all the apparent exchanges there had been, there were still unmet obligations on the researchers' side. Quite simply, they wanted academics to act. Their particular interest was in making knowledge exchange work. It was a matter of academic politics, among other things, and ECOPAS was a direct response. Pacific Islanders were certainly looking for the kind of institutional infrastructure that ECOPAS endorses, but infrastructure for what? The question has been asked many times before: what counts as knowledge? We're dealing with multiple layerings here, for each party was also aware of the backgrounds of the other. The Pacific Island scholars spoke of the responsibilities to the academy, as much as European scholars acknowledged those who had helped their research in the field. Everyone was acting on diverse registers. But was there also a divergence of registers, to use Isabel Stenger's term? If so, perhaps it was hidden in an appeal that the Pacific Islanders made, and to which the European scholars, largely, if not entirely, anthropologists at the time, eagerly responded: relations. Researchers had to acknowledge the obligations activated by their relations with people in the Pacific. This was a common language. Admittedly, Europeans need to be told what the islanders took for granted, but the former were very much aware of their relational obligations and happy, no doubt, that relationships with island scholars should be a sign of many others. A successful exchange will be the beginning, not the end, of future interchange. World restitution, acting on one's debts, was, in the words of this seminar, a step towards world reconstitution. Now, Donna Haraway taught us a long time ago that issues don't have to attach to whole persons. That's not the relevant mathematic, me and my culture. Rather, issues divide people in different ways. When she famously argued for politics and epistemologies of location, positioning, and situating, where partiality and not universality is the condition for being heard, the answer she gives as to what counts as knowledge turns crucially on recognizing the agency of the world and objects of knowledge as actors. And I'm going to give a half turn to this last phrase, and I'm sure Donna would concur. At least I hope very much she's going to concur. And I want to suggest that we might say the same of some of the means of knowledge. That phrase was that it's crucial to recognize the agency of the objects of knowledge as actors. So the half turn is to suggest that the same might be said of the means of knowledge. Situatedness was never simply an issue of identifying pre-existing interests, but of appreciating the co-constitution of interests, and in these we might say the form of knowing is an actor too, and plays its part. And this actor is certainly there in the idea of knowledge exchange. I think there is a divergence, but it's not between Pacific Islanders and Europeans. It's a divergence instantiated and concealed at the moment of agreement. The agreement is over the means to knowledge, that is, acknowledging relations in the first place. The divergence will lie in what on earth anyone takes relations to be. What counts as relations? That's the question that makes relations something of an actor. And it's an interesting question, I think, for cosmopolitics, for in European thought, and embracing its descendants in North America, of course, relations is what keeps the world together. Think about the architecture of the known world. I say known because it's knowledge of the world that the politics of research addresses, and that's a world held together by the demonstration of infinite relations, cause and effect, covariation, taxonomic hierarchies, evaluation, and in the view of the early modern philosopher John Locke, the greatest of these, comparison. There's no one thing, he wrote in 1690, with a simple idea, substance, mode, which is not capable of almost an infinite number of considerations in reference to other things. Relations are also a means for keeping the world together, thought of as connections between persons, however fractious and however we describe values, collectivities, organizations, intimacies, emotions, and so on, infinity all over again. It's very nice, though, that we don't have to even begin thinking about a nature-culture divide here. Pushed to it, most would, I think, assume that relational descriptions of the world are made possible by its inherently relational properties. The question as to what counts as knowledge is probably, in fact, going to be intimately bound up with the question as to what counts as relations. Here is a dialogue about knowledge, in a context where restitution is itself taken by claimants as reconstitution of the powers by which the world is moved. And although it took place in the UK, I'm almost embarrassed to relate it to you because its contours will be so familiar. And I don't know what Elizabeth Povinelli was talking about, but it certainly touches on her early work. When the UK Working Group on Human Remains in Museum Collections was preparing its report, it had representations, and that of course was the working group's view, both from scientific and other experts and from various First Nations communities, particular interest being generated by requests from Australian Aboriginal activists. Its remit was to draw up guidelines to assist UK legislation for the tenure and repatriation of human remains held in museums. And the remains ranged from skeletons to samples of hair and tissue. Scientific or research interest in such materials was justified by the medical and evolutionary information that the remains were capable of yielding, not only, note, as individual items, but in their relationship to other collections. It was feared that knowledge would be lost with repatriation. Statements from Indigenous or First Nations people in Australia, as well as from New Zealand and North America, were put side by side the research view. The Australian Aboriginal representatives, and I'm going to carry on using that word even though it's inappropriate in the present context, but this is how they were viewed by the working group. The Australian Aboriginal representatives talked about something quite different, kinship. Now this was fairly easy, that is for someone like myself, to understand in relational terms. They were pointing out that the Aborigines were related to their ancestors, while the scientists were not. The relations they had were different. In any event, their relationship made the Aborigines, that is kinsfolk, different kinds of people from those with research interests, strangers. The former did not inhabit a position from which an ancestor could also be a specimen. To the Aborigines, there was nothing more they needed to know in terms of information about themselves in order to press their claims, apart from the business of proving entitlement through dance and song, knowledge that would only be effective when deployed by those with the right to use it. Such effectiveness could not be transferred through acquiring someone else's knowledge. The UK Working Group bent over backwards to be open to cultural sensitivities. They did so with compassion and respect, all the same, on the basis of certain connotations of expert knowledge. Their premise was that knowledge is something that people habitually convert into information in their communications with one another. So when people say things about themselves, they are imparting information. When people disagree or have competing demands, the form of their interchange appears like a debate, as though positions defended or promulgated were positions in an argument. Dialogue or debate, in this view, fruitfully opens up information about the nature of the world, and sharing information is, of course, widely regarded as one route to reaching agreement. The working group's politics was articulated in its anticipation of the ends of the exercise to come to an agreement. The subsequent report assumed that communication was at stake. Cross-cultural understanding was the idiom in which it apprehended its task, and cultural difference could be managed like any other difference of viewpoint. Indeed, the document itself, this was the report they produced at the end, constructed out of diverse discussions, statements, and face-to-face representations, created the sense of a confrontation between two sides differentiated by their positions in an imagined interchange, each with its viewpoint or perspective. Either side, and this is still the working group's point of view, either side might attempt to persuade the other to see the force of the argument being put forward. A balance of viewpoints or a compromise position would inform the working group's recommendations. There was some sense, of course, that scientists were experts representing the interests of universal knowledge about the human condition, while the First Nations peoples were representatives of minority interests, expert in particular traditions or cultures. Nevertheless, the discussion on the working group's side ultimately framed these as perspectives that could be compared. Thus, one way forward was envisaged as independently supervised resolution procedures, and I quote, to foster a mood of understanding between the parties. The politics of the First Nation activists evoked another world. This was one from which dialogue itself looked very alien. Difference between the two sides could not be reduced to a difference of viewpoint, or to the idea that with discussion and information sharing, they, the First Nations people, would appreciate the context from which the scientists were operating and shift their own viewpoint accordingly. Informing the working group in turn of the context from which they, the First Nations people, were operating would not offer the basis of a compromise agreement from their side, for example, by allowing UK museums to retain portions of the materials for future DNA investigation. And some of this was expressed in the repeated refusal to acknowledge that their ancestors were in any sense scientific specimens. In short, there was no agreement to debate. But there was no agreement about knowledge either. Scientists, and I'm using that term for museum representatives taking a scientific or research view, suggested that if repatriation were inevitable, then in return for handing over the material, they could plan to extract knowledge from it first, with the understanding that such knowledge would be as available to the claimants as to anyone. This was taken as simply offensive. As I saw it, ultimately, the First Nations people regarded the confrontation between them and what they took to be the museum's entrenched view, not in terms of knowing at all. If anything, it was in terms of being, specifically being in a particular relation with the remains. Now, something like this scenario has been replayed countless times. There is a divide here between the kinds of relational potential the researchers saw, gaining more knowledge about the samples, and relations between persons. In the case of the First Nations peoples, relations offered a contrast between what the remains meant to them through their kinship and what it would mean to strangers. At this point, though, I must pause, because producing a relational model was my gloss. Their words sounded more like, we went to the Natural History Museum to see our ancestors and we were told we couldn't see them. For us, it's like going to see someone in hospital. To us, the people in museums are not dead, they are living. It is our direct ancestors that are being experimented on. The divergence here is radical. It was not that the scientists could not also take a relational perspective. Of course they could. But, and that is exactly what it would be, a relation that was also a relation between perspectives, putting oneself in another person's position as an enactment of a relation between different orders of knowledge. Yet if Aboriginal representatives regarded themselves as different kinds of people from the scientific researchers, their being could not be posed in terms of that kind of relation. The very idea that one might choose or agree to put oneself in the other's shoes comes close to being nonsense. And this is the exact point, of course, on which Helen Verron's Aboriginal work was forcefully taken up by John Law. And this surely is the stuff of cosmopolitics. At least I fervently hope that I've understood cosmopolitics. So let's go back to the Pacific Islanders. For they deliberately, if you recall, cast their claims in terms of knowledge. In their case, we are, of course, listening to an academic and thus a research-interested view. What they felt was that for all the interchanges there had been between themselves and waves of overseas researchers, there was still a deficit. But it could be made up through focusing on knowledge. ECOPAS was to endorse knowledge exchange as one of its work passages. As you've just seen, compromising on the demands of repatriation, the UK museum researchers would have been only too happy to have gone down that route. So is there nothing more to say? Members of the ECOPAS consortium will be the first to observe that the formula of knowledge exchange is no more than a provisional starting point. Indeed, it's based on a tacit agreement among the researchers, wherever they're from, that what is to count as knowledge cannot be assumed, hence the need, in fact, for an informed network. Obviously, there are countless ways in which to talk about what some of the issues might be, and I offer an anthropologist's sketch from one part of Papua New Guinea that would, I think, be quite widely recognizable. James Leach describes how the people of Raiti value knowledge in the form of narratives, stories that have an effect on the landscape as they do on persons. They are not marked out as an intellectual activity. He says differences are between kinds of people with different control over knowledge, not between intellectual and other forms of activity. In fact, people would only talk of knowledge that they themselves owned, and indeed for anything passed on to another, the owner would remain liable for its effects. I quote again, expressing knowledge amounts to claiming inclusion in the relationships, including those to land and spirits that generated the knowledge in the first place. Righty knowledge, being part of one's makeup, is something that connects one to others. In fact, Leach goes so far as to suggest that in this kind of transmission between persons, we're witnessing something analogous to what English speakers would call kinship. It's a kinship rooted in particular places, and land underwrites the social relationships it nurtures, knowledge inheres in particular landscapes. And he writes, when I have my head down, I'm quoting, if kinship is about the production of persons, then relations focused on and made possible by the emergence of knowledge are the basis of kinship. And he means this literally, knowledge and not bits of biological material is the substance that links people in close relations. That sharing knowledge makes kinship, in turn inflects what it might mean to exchange. In Righty, regular exchange is not of knowledge itself, but of the products of knowledge, the wealth and the food that a place produces. These are given to people from other places, primarily in-laws and maternal kin, as in competitive displays that acknowledge their nurturing contributions. So there are two kinds of relations here. A final kin are connected in a manner quite distinct from what binds people of a single place together. Affines are connected through the demonstrable effects of the potency and efficacy of knowledge, but they enjoy the products of that knowledge without controlling its source, for that belongs to others. Righty gives Leach pause for reflection. He sees a contrast with two deep-seated Euro-American assumptions, that knowledge can be detached from those who produce it and circulate without reference to them, and second, that its effect is not dependent on them, but on the correctness of its correlation with independently occurring phenomena in the world. As to the latter, of course, we've known for a long well, as to the former too, the issue that knowledge can be detached, we've known for a long time that it requires work to achieve and that detachment actually has to be created. The assumptions can take on a political cast when that work is concealed in a simple apprehension of knowledge as items of information. In what one could take as a miniature act of knowledge exchange, Leach co-authored a book on local plants with Pora Nombo, himself from Righty, juxtaposing descriptions in Talk Pisin, that's Neo-Melanesian Pidgin, and English, with Righty and botanical names. But it seemed less the presence of other knowledge than the format of the book that was to lead to questions. When it was launched in Papua New Guinea in a university setting, there was intense interest in reattaching the specimen photographs to the Righty author. Where exactly had the plants come from, and was Nombo responsible for their use in his village? The politics of attachment, and that is exactly what restitution, or the ecopass interest in the exchange of knowledge was about, shows up the politics of detachment. For the view of Nombo's Papua New Guinean interlocutors could not diverge further from the notion of knowledge distilled in a representation of the world. And Nombo himself talked of, and I'm quoting Leach again, knowledge as remembering, as acting, as thinking on an experience or moment of transmission between persons. It's clear what he describes is acting in and on interpersonal relations. The concept of knowledge itself, then, is a means to knowledge. One outcome of Euro-American usage, Leach concludes, is to see, and you will realize the source of this, of course, is to see diverse local knowledges as different versions of viewpoint on a common world. But the commensurability that the concept apparently offers, and thus the basis of agreement or exchange, runs up against different evaluations when that common world is uncovered by Euro-American researchers as the reference point for estimating effectiveness. Only some knowledge is recognized as such. He thus suggests following another route and thinking about transformations and effects around a recognition that things are or could be knowledge. And he says, so the impetus to redefine things as knowledge is exactly the process we should be interrogating. Openness to knowledge exchange, then, doesn't get us out of the impasse that was so striking in the museum's claims case. Rather, we find ourselves rehearsing very similar issues, including how we should be imagining relations. To take a leaf out of Leach's book and transfer his question of knowledge to relations themselves, should we be looking at the effect of recognizing relations? But that would really take another lecture to address properly, and that's what I'm proposing to do at Santa Cruz. The point of raising it here is to make evident the shifts in epistemic relations that have accompanied my argument to this point. They give the familiar sensation that one question only ever seems to open out into another. A Pacific Island scholar comes to the rescue. Andrew Mutu, himself from Arapesh, that's Margaret Mead's Arapesh, and working as an anthropologist in Yatmur, Gregory Bateson's Yatmur, both in Papua New Guinea, of course, brings me up short. I quoting from Mutu. Contra Strathern, I argue that what distinguishes relationships ontologically from the epistemological forms of relational practices, such as connection, association, resemblance, comparison, etc., is necessity and transcendence, which gives relationships the character of an infinite being. In a single stroke, he arrests the shifts by making a cut in how I've been referring to relations. He wishes to get away from what he sees as my obsession, although he's far too polite to call it that, with an epistemological understanding of relationality. Rather, what we need, he says, is an ontological theory of relationships, and it is there in Yatmul. Mutu takes the Yatmul person as embodying a pair of brothers who are life and death to one another. What he calls the ontology of brotherhood exists as an internal necessity that leads to an orientation towards a certain kind of becoming. One brother is always becoming the other brother. Now, the reference to brothers recalls what Marisol has already laid out for us. In her rubric to the Seminar Series, she discusses Eduardo Viveros de Castro's famous comparison of paradigmatic or canonical relations between certain indigenous peoples of Amazonia on the one hand, and on the other, Brazilians and other Western peoples from a Euro-Christian background. For the latter, brotherhood is in itself the general form of relation, where the Amazonian form would be the affinity of brothers-in-law. Brotherhood speaks to partners in relation being connected through what they have in common, so they are each in the same relation to a third term, whereas brothers-in-law are linked by the difference that divides them. However, the brotherhood here is not at all what Mutu was describing for the Melanesian Yatmul. There, elder is divided from younger. Indeed, at its most radical, life is the elder brother and death the younger, this being a conceptualization that applies to both men and women. Yatmul brothers are more like Amazonian brothers-in-law than they're like Euro-Christian brothers, whose similarity gives them a common identity. Mutu is not just making a plea for ontology. He is showing us relationships in an unusual form, and this is, of course, the very stuff of ethnographic inquiry. We can find other paradigmatic relations. For example, it would be hard not to come away from Elizabeth Roberts' recent account of assisted conception in the Ecuadorian Andes and think one was in anything but the presence of a distinctive mode of Christianity that valorized relationships as possession or encompassment, the form of relation as that of patron and client. But I would be abusing your patience in bringing in more names. The argument, that is the argument about how we should be imagining relations, can be made with reference to two already familiar to you. One is embodied here, Donna Haraway, and one will be embodied next time the seminar convenes, Alberto Corson-Jimeni. I mentioned Corson-Jimeni for a paper he wrote with an anthropologist of Siberia, where he offers, I quote, an indigenous redescription of the Euro-American concept of the relation. It does not resemble a relation. In fact, it takes a non-relational shape, which is why he says redescription. It is something that accompanies Yugahir hunters, their shadow force, an immaterial twin that appears simultaneously with the perceived person. All physical entities have this hidden side. Things are never just themselves, but always something else as well. And although I can't elaborate here, this leads to a kind of internal cosmopolitics in hunters' relations, now with their kin, and now with the source of their fuel and ammunition, their Russian sponsors. The elk hunter himself is always on two missions, a visible and an invisible one. The hunter is able to seduce the elk because his shadow spirit has already seduced the elk spirit. Significantly, these are not just homologies, that would be a relation. Rather, the hunter's shadow spirit, it is said, moves in and out of these two hunts, turning the visible and the invisible inside out and recasting the shadows of both worlds as it sneaks between their limits. Given that every being casts such a shadow, has such a spirit, and of course the English language gets quite impossible at this point, Course in Hymne perceives it, that is the shadow, working like the general category of concept. However, it's one whose conviction rests not on definition, but on a specific effect. As one might say, righty knowledge is known through its effects. The effect here is its capacity for self-displacement. In other words, one recognizes a concept not because one can lay out the relations of one entity with other entities or lay out the relations of comparison, but from the way it creates its own space for expression. Basically, then, this shadow points to an idea of an entity or a being that is also something else. This is not a description of the Euro-American concept of relation, but a redescription in Yugahir terms. When these Siberians tell themselves what something is, they evoke its outline in the shadow it casts, even though the shadow is not it. The analogy with relation, we could say, lies in the procedure by which Euro-Americans might appeal to the connections, through the comparisons of difference and similarity, say, that the entity in question has to others. We have, of course, been listening to this account in the presence of someone whose redescriptions of the world have fired the social imagination since at least 1985. They did so before, and they haven't ceased since, but that was the date of Donna's astonishingly prescient and first manifesto. It describes the capacity of cyborgs to dissolve the kinds of dualisms and boundaries that belong to the politics of domination, including the domination of women. But cyborgs do not do so through reinstating sisterhood. That would simply be a form of brotherhood in the Euro-American sense. Or that would imply a homology, where one might seek rather for a conceptual form nearer to a shadow or the outline of something else. Above all, it's not that everything is connected up in some kind of system of perfect communication that overcomes dualisms. Cyborgs activate something else altogether, namely the power of the integrated circuit, where there is no ontological difference between the cyborg as a circuit of possibilities in its environment, social, global, military, industrial, ecological, and its environment as a circuit of possibilities. The heterogeneity of one is also the heterogeneity of the other. Taking the circuit as a concept, it's a concept that constantly displaces one experience, one intimacy, one brutality for another. The circuit does not look at all like a relation. So why should I even imagine any connection? Why should I even imagine that it does? The cyborg itself was imagined at a precise moment in scientific feminist history to capture, among other things, the then emergent feedback loops of communication technopolitics, the already apparent effects of the microchip revolution. Although I put in brackets that the cyborg was always more than simply a hybrid of concepts. It's this very situatedness that seems, looking back on it, so evocative now. And in truth, it evokes for me something of the fascination of the relation. The relation as the circuit on a semiconductor of modern Euro-American knowledge-making, perhaps. Think again of the architecture of the known world, to the way that we connect it up because our knowledge of it connects it up. Consider the ubiquitous capacity of relations to at once link whatever we want and uncover the way things are already linked, and then turn around and grin back at us because it has assimilated everything to its form. I have for some time been impressed with this, and thinking about Donna's amazing cyborg, it amazes me all over again. Something of the relation's contours are revealed precisely by something that does not look like it. Yet we seem to have moved away from Mutu's crisp distinction between epistemic relations and ontologically grounded relationships. The description of these concepts has shifted almost imperceptibly back to an interweaving of the epistemological or conceptual and the interpersonal. And I mean description, how they're made known. If I were to embrace Mutu's approach to ontology, I might be tempted to suggest that for modern Euro-Americans, relating is at once necessary to and transcendent of knowledge-making, and that conversely, knowledge is a part of relating. The cyborg appeared at a specific moment, but so too, in a manner of speaking, and over a longer duration, did the relation. This brings me to my conclusion. You'll recall my brief mention of Roberts, who studied assisted conception in the Ecuadorian Andes. She relates how her daughter interpreted an interchange between what to the ethnographer was a matter of a dark-skinned Indian servant, a live-in maid, combing the hair of a light-skinned girl from her employer family. Her own 7-year-old said that the girl must be adopted. She had deduced this from the difference in skin color and from the hair combing that to her meant a mother-child relationship. She had the concept of a relation then, even though she got the categories wrong. More than 300 years earlier, this is exactly what the philosopher Locke had predicted. One can have the idea of a relation without knowing what are being related. This came from his disquisition on knowledge and came arguably at a moment when a modern apprehension of relations was in the making. It's interesting that Locke drew examples directly from interpersonal ties, specifically the field of procreation and kinship. Indeed, this afforded one of his favorite sources of analogy, and I quote, "Those who have far different ideas of a man may yet agree in the notion of a father." Although reciprocals such as father and son or husband and wife, which are among his examples, show relations most clearly, relations are present whenever one idea brings another in its train, hence the emphasis he lay on comparison. There are as many relations as there are ways of comparing things together. At first blush, it seems that this kind of relation to which Locke looks for an analogy is none other than the paradigmatic or canonical relation of brotherhood. It might refer to fathers and sons or husbands and wives, but brotherhood is its general form. In his exposition, Viveris de Castro was concerned specifically with situating difference and similarity, and with generic notions of how to connect to others who might otherwise be unrelated. My focus here is one of the premises of the canonical Euro-American relation. The link in question is held to be between entities that have a prior existence and whose similarities, compared with reference to a third term, then become apparent, whether created or discovered. And that has nothing to do or imply that they are equals. However, there's a further twist to Locke's usage. For the analogy that he's using, that is the analogy of father and son, is seemingly being used to elucidate a form that is exactly the inverse, namely where the relation is known, but the terms, whether to be created or discovered, are not. And that, to my mind, is a different premise altogether. Here the kinship designation was particularly apt for Locke's purposes. There is no parent without there also being a child. From this point of view, the term father, like brother, is the outcome of relations. And English kin terms, it would seem, carry us as easily from one viewpoint to the other. Indeed, inversion is another form of relating in the Euro-American repertoire and allows its practitioners an intellectual agility that makes them think they can simultaneously describe the world they know and ones that they don't. Yet it doesn't always, not entirely, and not quite. Let me rehearse this again. If the canonical or paradigmatic form of the relation is that of brotherhood, this is as true of epistemic as of interpersonal relations. Two entities are connected through the link of similarity between them, terms linked by a relation. Euro-American thinkers can inverse this and imply the inversion to other systems of thought, as Marisol very appropriately reminds us. And indeed, the Pacific Islanders dealing with the English language, like their ethnographers, could well find this something of an intellectual resource. So to recall the question of what on earth anyone takes relations to mean, clearly we're dealing with different forms, but in this case the difference springs from the comparison or relations between them. One can as equally well say these forms are related. And that's why I wanted to draw attention to analogies to the concept of relation that did not look like relations at all. These analogies work by being outside the field altogether. The Siberian shadow, the American cyborg. These aren't bridges. The one jumps worlds without connecting them. The other, needy for connection, inhabits worlds only as wired up as it is. Cosmopolitics, we hear again Stenger's admonition that divergence is not relational, it is constitutive. Within its own Euro-American field, the relation becomes folded into the interplay between individual and collective, for individual terms may either occupy the position of pre-existing entities or be rendered distinct, that is, individuated, by their being brought into relation. And this is us, this is our modernity. When scholars agree that what counts as knowledge is bound up by what counts as relations, they're also drawing down the situated creativity of a particular ontology. The relation is a tool as handy as a handheld device and as intimate or remote as a voice in one's ear as the microchip. Only it's not quite this. It is one that in the present era also enables scholars to build a few bridges. Thank you.
Right there. Oh, well. That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. Wait a minute. I'll put it this way. Okay, it's just, it has a certain attitude. I'm perfectly, it doesn't matter. Yeah, got it. We're fine. Yeah, as long as you guys see it, that's all that matters. This is on, this is what I need, right? No, that, it's for later. Look, what Marilyn has done for decades is, with an ethnographer's precision and exquisite love of detail and ear for the nuance and the specificity, constantly interrupt Euro-Christian, Euro-American, Euro-Euro ways of worlding with a range of other worldings that she also knows in exquisite detail, both from her own work and the work of close affines in her disciplinary environment of social anthropology, particularly British social anthropology, which has distinct differences from the ways it's practiced in the colonies, both Brazilian and United Statesian. This way that Marilyn interrupts worlds with worlds, Euro worlds with very specific other worlds that redo the very possibilities of thinking at all, is what I feel like is her fundamental gift to me and to us. Now, she very excessively and characteristically modestly says there are those, Andrew moved to, who might complain about her obsession with epistemological relationality, but frankly, I doubt it. I doubt very much that he's complaining, because I think one of the many things that Marilyn gives us in this constant thinking thoughts with thoughts, and not at all clear which thinking normalizes which other thinking, which thinking apparatuses hold still in order to be used as a tool to think some other thinking with. The tool is constantly shifting hands in Marilyn's way of working. And in the process of that, she is worlding and building worlds. So I decided to title my few comments and riffs before we open it up to a larger conversation, Opening Up Relations and Cutting Detachments, or Donna Haraway redescribes Marilyn Strathern. And I'm inspired by Gary Larson. I think of those two, I think of that one woman down below as really having a shadow figure, and that there are two of them tied up there. And that let's go outside and play with this ball. Let's go outside and unwind the sticky threads, rebuild the patterns. Let's engage in string figures. Let's engage in speculative fabulation, science fiction, science fact, speculative feminism so far, on a background of lichens, which that will become more important as we proceed. Now, one of the many things that Marilyn gave us is an understanding of the relation as built of a potentially indefinite, if not infinite, series of duplexes. And that specific duplexes, which don't map isomorphically onto each other, are taken up in different fields of practice, such that the duplex of the scientist, this back and forthing between invented and discovered, or the duplexing of the anthropologist, this constant back and forthing between interpersonal relations and social structural conceptual ideas. Those duplexes aren't isomorphic to each other, but they both work as a kind of they are both in the family tree of Peter Ramus. They are both in the family tree of the Europeans who work by bifurcation, that amazingly productive, knowledge-generating, world-generating apparatus of splitting and splitting and splitting and splitting and splitting, so that the history of chemistry or the history of language or the history of anything can't be told in this idiom without knowing one's kinship debt, one's relational debt to that very interesting grammatical and logical apparatus of the Middle Ages, this way of doing the world through duplexes. Okay? Well, there are, of course, other ways of doing the world, including in the Euro world. The many Euros that don't work by duplexes, which Marilyn knows exquisitely and operationalizes at various moments, but often tends to hold still the duplex in order to let, say, the Yatmel do the work on the duplex. Not too often does the Euro do the work of not being duplicitous in this particular way. But the practice of the child's game of cat's cradle, or jeu de ficelle, or string figures, that, among others, Europeans play, although the early European ethnologists made the mistake, as they collected these games from, among other places, Oceania, made the mistake of thinking that they were all versions of the same game. In other words, the usual kind of operation that one understands at the root of the history of biology, the root of history of anthropology, at our root, this way of finding a common world by comparing its versions, and only one set of knowers has control of the common world and can invite others into sharing it, thus Kantian cosmopolitics, the kinds of the Immanuel Kant's cosmopolitics, the kinds of cosmopolitics that made Isabel Stenger's wretch in a public philosophical vomiting out of that cosmopolitics, for instead the kind of cosmopolitics where there is not a common world, but there might, just maybe, be a way of getting on. Just maybe there will be a future that is common enough to address the damages that are irreversible. Just maybe a cosmopolitics is possible in the face of the ruins. It's not an optimistic cosmopolitics. It's not a holistic cosmopolitics, but it is one that says it is still possible to tie a pattern, to pass a relay, to hold in your hands the pattern that nobody asked for. And the only reason you have anything to say about it is that it turned up in your hands, and you damn well better do something about it. Dropped threads, relays, patterning, string figuring, cat's cradling, speculative fabulation, worlding, cosmopolitics. So which cosmopolitics are at stake is the key question. How'd that happen? We're ahead of ourselves. Good enough. I have, of course, as my string figure game, one that I avoided intellectual property issues by having my husband do the pattern rather than lifting it from the internet in a way I would have done had a person from, quote, my own community, close quote, put a picture on the internet. Where was this tiny little scruple about not taking a Navajo image without getting prior permission? Instead, I had my husband duplicate the Navajo image, and I took a photograph of it and put it up there with the Diné word transliterated into the European phonetic alphabet. A whole very interesting series of thefts and appropriations and profferings and avoidances and good and bad faith, and showing how cheating works. Okay? Okay. And showing how cheating works with a title of this particular string figure, by the way, published on the internet by a Navajo Christian guy, who, among other things, uses this as part of his evangelical practice, Coyotes Running Opposite Ways, which, of course, from anyone who thinks about trickster figures and cyborgs, couldn't possibly avoid. Now, on that foundation, such as it is, I want to go back to the UK working group on human remains in museum collections. Now, Marilyn read a very interesting, this is the way it probably sounded to the Australian Aboriginals, pointing out that the very concept, the very terminology of Australian Aboriginal is itself a problem. It was marked and she moved on, but the problem, of course, is the very people who are claiming their ancestors as opposed to agreeing to a viewpoint on either specimens or ancestors, as if those were alternative viewpoints. Those very people had, of course, had their precise ancestral lines cut. This is a grouping that only makes sense in the face of the multiple cuttings of country, cuttings of those who could take care of place, cuttings of precisely those who might own the remains in the museums, but in a substitutional apparatus claiming the remains in these very interestingly worlded, reworlded, patterned, repatterned remakings of taking care of country or taking care of place or building up who owns which knowledge, such that your claiming this knowledge for research or as a specimen is not another viewpoint, but yet another theft. But the very process of making that claim depended on multiple genocides and exterminations and reworldings. Okay? And it's that interests, I think, all of us in this question of indigenous politics. The attachments and detachments in the face of irreversible loss, that kind of loss which cannot be addressed by restitution. The face of irreversible loss such that the moral or ethical or political relationship to the world called moving on is truly not on. Moving on is precisely what cannot be allowed to happen. Remember that Marilyn's very first example was from a group of Pacific Island activists and, well, all scholars from Fiji, from Papua New Guinea, from UK, from Canada, from wherever, all scholars addressing the urgency of climate change. Well, addressing the urgency of climate change in Oceania has a particular edge to it, it must be said. This question of what counts as knowledge resting on multiple kinds of extractions and exterminations, and then and the ongoing commitment to something that might as well be called restitution, without for a minute thinking the losses are irreversible, without for a minute thinking that the coral reef systems on this planet that are already dead can actually be restored, without thinking for a minute that it isn't a real possibility that 50 years from now there will be no living coral reefs, and what that might mean to the peoples of the Pacific. That's the context within which these matters matter, okay? So it matters which worlds, which knowledge is no knowledge, which thoughts think thoughts. Precisely the detachments and attachments matter in the context of multiple extinctions, exterminations, and genocides, and irreversible human mass-induced death. And human, of course, is I use that 18th century term on purpose, although it's ambiguous. Never mind, I'm not going there. Okay, now, I'm going back to the UK working group on human remains in museum collections and what it sounded like to them. For us, it's like going to see somebody in the hospital. To us, hospital is a fabulous thing to point out at that point. What, in hospice care in the museum? Yeah, sort of. Okay, to us, the people in the museum are not dead. They are living. It is our direct ancestors that are being experimented on. The part Marilyn didn't read but is in my text. How can research possibly compare? Well, I actually think that's a real question. How can research possibly compare? Because, well, for a zillion reasons. And the case of giving back stolen human remains, where everybody understands that it's straight up theft, on the basis of which some extremely important molecular genetic, population genetic knowledge, some very extremely important historical accounts of the movements of peoples, extremely important accounts of multi-species associations and diseases, all kinds of amazingly fabulous stuff was built up on the basis of theft. Well, that's no surprise. Most of American capitalism was based on the theft of bodies. Wealth based on theft is not new. Okay? Now, wealth based on being fed wrongly, called greed, let's say among the Haganers, Marilyn teaches me in another paper, wealth based on theft is still real wealth. So how can research compare? What if that research were, let's say, now I'm moving to Lisa Curran's work in Kalimantan, and with the mast flowering and ectomycorrhizal associations, critical to thinking about species diversity in Kalimantan forests that are being turned into palm oil plantations as we speak. I'm sure a whole other palm oil plantation has been planted in the length of time it took me to say this sentence. Okay? The mycorrhizal associations in the soil samples are probably very, very, very important to various kinds of recomposition and partial restitutions of blasted forests and ways of living and dying in these forests, where total restoration is out of the question. Will there be any kinds of restitution or recuperation? Well, among the many things that depends on, as Lisa Curran is the first to say, is soil samples. Well, it turns out these days you can't get soil samples out of Indonesia because of various kinds of putting a stop to biopiracy and intellectual property theft and many other things. I'm way oversimplifying the question. But one of the things that happens is that whole bodies of researchers just find it too fucking much trouble and stop taking soil samples, stop trying to transport the work to, the material to graduate students, et cetera, and so on, leaving it in the hands of, let's say, the people who are marketing palm oil around the world. So how can research possibly compare? When I would have been, I wouldn't have justified holding on to the human remains in the UK working group, but I would have snuck in at night and taken a core of a bone sample and hid it. Okay. No, I actually wouldn't have done that, but I'm trying. Well, I might have. I'm trying to say something about the ongoing, about the realness of wealth produced on theft. About about knowledge that matters for worlding. That knowledges are worlds. But look what I did. I said, okay, I snuck in at night. I realized immediately that these were their ancestors, not mine, and frankly, turning somebody's ancestor into a specimen is not a flaming good idea. okay? But maybe if I told them I cheated, instead of the false respect of saying, oh, we've got just different viewpoints, if we're really incredibly sensitive to each other, we can figure this out. Okay, and surely you'll understand if we just keep them for a little while and then give them back to you then. That would be fine. No wonder they were offended. That's unbelievable. On the other hand, if I said, look, I'm going to cheat, okay, you can either stop me or look the other way. But I actually think this sample is pretty important. And I'm going to cut the detachment of attachment to the fiction of universal knowledge and in fact outline the routes of ongoing theft and cheating. I'm exaggerating for the sake of emphasis here. But I'm doing it on purpose. I'm actually saying that question of how can research compare is a burning question among us right now in all sorts of really, really, really important disputes where a perspectivist point of view approach just won't work, nor will any adoption of somebody else's better way of thinking, as if there were such a thing. And all of these issues are taking place in the context of multiple and urgent killings and exterminations. This is not a joke. So I want to kind of segue into a conclusion, sort of a conclusion here, by moving to another recent paper that Marilyn wrote called Eating and Feeding, okay, where she starts with this typical Strathernian, hyper-modest, little tiny point, that most of Western philosophy is done based on having and being and what happens if you just use eating. She points out that other people had thought similar thoughts to that and so on, and this wasn't totally original with her, and quirky quirk is perfectly original in terms of the way that paper turns out. But so I want to just use one little piece of that paper. She takes us in the sort of in the final bravura section of the paper to Mount Hagen, where she spent a lot of time as a writer and as an ethnographer and as a doer in the world. And she takes us to a marriage, to a situation in which mother's daughter is going off to groom's home to be fed by groom's mother. And so the bride daughter, okay, can no longer be fed by her maternal mother. I guess you could have to say maternal mother. Anyway, you guys are anthropologists. Yeah. Now, the bride's mother was herself once a bride. So we're going to call her the bride mother, which is what Marilyn calls her, the bride mother and the bride daughter. The bride mother has been growing the daughter for these many years, and has been feeding her, has been putting her together literally with the yams and the pigs and God knows, probably, all the stuff. This is in so-called old Melanesia. So the bride daughter has been grown by the capacities of the bride mother, and the bride daughter is then sent off to groom's home and will be fed then, presumably, by a whole bunch of folks, but by groom's mother in particular. But her fertility now, which has been grown by the bride mother, is relocated. There is a detachment in order to permit attachments. But come the bride mother's way, this gorgeous pig, the biggest and livest and most amazing and sparkly pig of all. This really fantastic pig enters the scene to the bride mother. Okay, this pig has probably been fed by the groom's mother, maybe others too, but this pig is coming to the bride mother as what exactly? Well, Marilyn makes this really interesting move. There's a kind of a funerary gift. It's a kind of death compensation payment. It's a compensation for the cutting of a capacity. It's the compensation for a little death of the bride mother, who can no longer, perfectly well see her daughter and a million other things, but she can't any longer grow her fertility. It's done. It's cut. And she gets this amazing living pig that presumably will turn into food along the line. On the other hand, it's the only living pig, if I read the piece correctly, that's given at this particular ceremony. And that pig is doing some very interesting work. It's a gift. It's a funerary gift. It's marking a death. It's marking a detachment. And I thought that was a really interesting story. We're kind of working into this one. in this way. What happens if Europeans like me who want to sneak in at night and cheat on the research samples, okay, or other really horrible ideas? What happens if following, say, Tom Van Dorn and Debbie Bird Rose's work in Australia, who worry about what it is to write in a time of extinctions and exterminations, following up on Tom's recent book called Flightways, where he's looking at the webs of connections and disconnections around birds living on the dull edge of extinction, living on the ledge of extinction. It's not a point, it's a ledge. Okay. What happens if we use this bride mother, bride daughter cutting up capacity to think about the Euroscientist type, me with my sneaking in at night? What happens if we scientist types, wearing my biologist hat, what happens if we submit to the little death of detaching detachments? Okay? Tiny little change in the way science works. It's a change that lots of other folks have spoken out in various ways. Bruno Latour has done versions of this. Lots of folks have. What happens if, instead of just laying out how detachments are done, we cut detachments and start doing what Marilyn very nicely said my cyborg did, and I wish it had, which is the way she puts it. Hang on, she really does it really nicely. Okay, the cyborg, needy for connection, inhabits a world only as precisely as it is wired up, and in no other way. Okay. So going back to Tom's birds, I want to take the whooping crane and the sandhill cranes. Whooping cranes are, quote, endangered, close quote. I mean, really big time. They're in serious trouble. Whooping cranes are the subject of world restitution, world recuperation, rehabilitation, species survival plans. Okay? Whooping cranes are subject to this apparatus of species survival plans. Okay? Well, that turns out to be extremely interesting in terms of who is detached from what in order to do that. The female whooping cranes, who must produce eggs at a much greater rate than any normal whooping crane ever could in real life whooping crane land, okay, will be in lifelong captivity, putting out eggs as fast as possible, which will be incubated by sandhill cranes, who in sacrificial surrogacy are enlisted as low-paid reproductive labor for the endangered whooping cranes. Technologies, little airplanes are developed to look enough like whooping cranes to guide fledgling whooping cranes to possible new habitats that have been tested by still other birds for their predators to see who can survive how in this place where these endangered whooping crane kids are going to be relocated. Okay? And meanwhile, laboratory people, having realized that imprinting baby birds on inappropriate objects that might be useful early on in the bird's life, like people who look like people, is a really bad idea, now dress up sort of like whooping cranes. In the hot Florida sun and elsewhere, you know, they're wearing these whooping crane costumes, supposedly fooling the baby whooping cranes, or fooling them enough, fooling them just enough. Okay, scientists are going to extraordinary ends to work the connections and disconnections, and to figure out who sacrifices for who else's capacity to hatch, capacity to transfer ongoingness from one place to another. So I'm thinking that story is a pretty good one for thinking with these worldwide confrontations around whose kinds of knowledges do what to who else's. The sandhill cranes and the whooping cranes, they aren't metaphors for people. They are actually existing birds doing this work. Okay? And the work is about restitution or something like that, where loss is seriously irreversible, but because it's seriously irreversible, is no excuse for not taking restitutional action. Okay? So just because these deaths can't be reversed is absolutely zero excuse for not trying to do a string figure for flourishing worlds. Okay? And I think the whooping crane, sandhill crane, human technology story is one among a zillion that could be told, and that won't work by duplexes exactly, although they appear everywhere, but work precisely by the extraordinary palpability, materiality, semiotic materiality of these connections, not those, cut those, build that, and not everything is either possible or allowed. That's the kind of story that I think Marilyn makes me need to tell. And this is actually for the Santa Cruz part too, but it's again tantalizing. A biologist friend of mine wrote a paper recently called The Symbiotic View of Life, where we have never been human, and ends it with the sentence, "We are all lichens." And he means it seriously. He means, okay, Eurotypes have for a zillion years, or for a long time, thought that if you've got an evolutionary view of the world, you make certain kinds of moral claims on other folks by virtue of telling this origin story. Well, I'm doing that too, and I'm also saying this story is probably true. This story, which puts pay to the Anthropocene and instead evokes what? Multi-species cosmopolitics as a way of thinking these questions of extinctions and exterminations, is about from the get-go, the world is built by indigestion, partial digestion, eating and feeding on each other, and there has never been either a one or a two. But these entities, these multi-species entities, are the name of the game of life on Earth. That's an ontological claim as well as an epistemological one. And it's invented by high-throughput RNA analysis. It's invented by the apparatuses of molecular biology and discovered in all the usual ways Western scientists are used to make this kind of claim. We are all lichens. Enough.
So we'll entertain questions now, and we'll ask you to speak up loud because you're there, and we might not be able to hear you here. So questions are very welcome. Questions, comments, additions, cheating.
While people are thinking about questions, can I just say one thing, which is Donna has made it all worthwhile, me writing that paper. It was worth doing in order to hear that response. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the paper. So, the first paper I read of Marilyn's was that No Nature, No Culture, the Hagener in that No Nature, No Culture book. And that was a paper that Jim Clifford and I used to build our Introduction to History of Consciousness graduate students in the early 80s. So there's this long trading feeding zone between Davis, Joe Duman, I think, took that course, Corey Hayden, anyway. Karen Kaplan was in, I think, the very first instance of that course. Anyhow, Marilyn was one of the bride mothers or something. Anyway, who's the big? Anyway, enough.
Maybe I'll just make one further comment, if I may. This is the duplex striking back. I forget now where. No, it's in When Species Meet. You have this wonderful cartoon of lapdogs. Having to know thy enemy. They're looking at a picture of a laptop, yes?
Well, it's a meeting of the American Association of Lapdogs. with a picture of a laptop on the
that's
screen, and the keynote speaker is saying, "Know your enemy."
No enemy. I mean, I just want to defend my little duplexes, which I suppose I regard as the enemy in a sense. But I think one needs to know them. I think that's all I would say.
I want to ask a question about relations. Relations, it's one of those words that is part of the common property of ordinary people, which is one of the things makes it interesting.
Absolutely.
As you specify in all kinds of ways. And then there's relation, as it has very specific meanings in history of logic or the history, various technical and professional histories. And people like me have fought hard for a relational view of the biological world, whereby the partners don't pre-exist the relatings, but are in turtles all the way down, and you never start from zero. There's no place you start that is other than the gerund relating. So my question is, this is straight up indigen Euro thinking, but when you use the word the relation, is it really the same thing as what is its relation to the gerund relatings, to the verbal forms as opposed to the noun forms? What do you do with process philosophies?
Okay. But this is why bringing in Andrew Mutu was so important, because he happens to use a distinction between relation and relationship because he wants to
hold on to relationship.
Relationship as human beings do not exist but in relations, and that's what he means by relationship. So I would say that in the same way that the kind of fundamental state of being relation that you're referring to can be understood ontologically in that sense. That I don't have a problem with that. But you have touched on. Okay, I'll say this, and then we really do have to open this up. Yeah. But you've actually touched on something that's really significant, and I don't know what to do with, and I'm still scrubbing away at the edges and so forth. But it's to do with the fact that when one comments on a particular set of concepts, that the assumption is that one is critiquing them, and the assumption that then follows that if you critique, then you get rid of.
Which doesn't follow.
That further step simply isn't necessary, which is why I end rather peculiarly by saying that actually we need relations, and relations are bridges, and relations do something that the shadow and the cyborg don't do, which is why. But I didn't really work it out. But this issue of, well, I used to do it with audit. I can explain with all the audit stuff. I used to put that under the rubric of critique of good practice. You're not critiquing bad practice. You're opening up good practice. Well, in the same way with relation, I wouldn't want to throw it out of our repertoire any more than I would want to throw out rights or something like that, or property, or even though we can critique those to the cows come home.
You remember that old feminist paper that looked at one of the sort of the early years when deconstruction and post-structuralism hit the Anglophone world, and notions of the subject and the human became especially naughty. And there was this wonderful paper that as soon as women got to be subjects and humans, that train pulled out of the station. And it wasn't shiny anymore to think like that. But woe be to anyone who thought women, much less other beings, could do without notions of human and subject and stay alive, throughout the day.
Absolutely.
It was a really good. But there is this, I think, affect that happens in scholarly practice in the face of critique is to show how something works, not to show how you need to throw it away.
Indeed.
Okay. That said, critique has an emotional effect on those who hear it, which is to say that has been done and now I have to do something new. And that happens in these debates too, or in not debates, but in these patternings too. And I think that has to do with that issue of staying with the trouble, not moving on, mourning with, not mourning about, M-O-U-R-N. That they're staying with the trouble, the tools, that's the habit of soul that we don't nurture very effectively.
That's wonderfully put. Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. That's really.
Yes. Speak up.
Just to follow on from that, I mean, I think you're pointing to something that's much larger than just an affect of academia. I mean, it's to look at it another way is that it's an obsession with novelty and generative novelty at that. That once someone has made the critique, well, I can't make that critique now either, and if I persist on, then I'll clearly that's no longer moving forward in the field. But the same thing happens in my own studies on social networking as well, particularly in business and so forth. Is that what happens is the whole point of networking with other people is to generate creative, opportunistic moments where you can generate something new, whether it's a new business or a new technology or a new policy. But the whole focus of networking is the same sort of thing, and it brings back around to another kind of relation, which is this sort of obsessive. Compared to Marilyn, it makes an obsession with relations look perfectly normal, actually, I think so.
And we can collect comments and then open up another round of conversations and use the idea of improvisation to continue bouncing back from the audience to the podium. Yes, Anupam.
So, first of all,
Just
thank you.
very loud.
Thank you very much for these brilliant thoughts, kind of tour de force presentations for both of you. I wanted to ask you a little bit about that clandestine operation of stealing the genetic resource in the middle of the night. And I wanted to place it in a kind of real-world context, in a different context, where the thief might also feel justified in the theft in a particular way. And so I'm thinking here of Chevron Texaco, of Texaco Chevron in Ecuador. And so, as you know, what Texaco did for decades is really exploit the land, exploit the mineral resources, and then engaged in tremendous devastating pollution along the way, right? Just depositing the byproducts of the oil exploration into onto the soil, basically, and destroying enormous amounts of land in the process. Now, that might not seem clandestine, but I think in some sense it really was clandestine, because it happened in these faraway places that weren't well reported upon in the kind of larger media that Chevron and Texaco might have been more responsive to. And at the same time, they would have felt that this was the right thing to do. And so this is, and the way they would justify it to themselves is to say, we are helping develop Ecuador. We're doing it with the support of the government, perhaps. The government, these ephemeral governments that relied upon these, the foreign exchange that this would bring, et cetera, to buy them a little bit more time. And so the worry about that kind of clandestine nature of it, which allows you to self-justify your action and not have it kind of then be reviewed, except maybe decades later when it's finally revealed. I wonder how you feel about taking that impulse and translating into this other context, totally radically different than where that impulse began.
Mind you, I didn't say it was actually all right for my spirit self to go in and steal samples at night. No. It seems to me that implicit, explicit in what we're doing is the affirmation of being for some ways of life and not others. That being allied with, tied with, accountable to, owned by, whatever, that the ontological, semiotic, that the multiple registers of casting your capacities for some ways of life and not others is the issue, and not the question of secrets and legitimacy of means and cover-ups and so forth. Those are very real matters, but I think there's a prior matter there that has to do with, I don't care if the Ecuadorian government is for a petrochemical global empire. Casting oneself for some worlds and not others is part of worlding. And that means casting everything you've got against some worlds and not others, and there's zillions of ambiguous spaces where the for and against doesn't sort out that easily. But there's nothing about this that allows ethical neutrality into this conversation. And that finding oneself owned by someone, is usually, it's like finding the pattern is in your hands and you didn't ask for it, whoever the you is. Choice plays a very small role in these matters of being owned and therefore owing something.
Margaret, and then Ivan.
I wanted to go back to the original example that you started with, Marilyn. I wanted to go back to the example of ECOPAS, and which struck me as a very interesting consortium anyway, of concern about Pacific Islanders by Northwest Atlantic countries. So they're oceanic in both senses, and it seems to me there actually would be some common interests with both oceans in the face of climate change, with rising oceans and disappearances of a very major kind, not only of the coral reefs, but of whole islands, right? But I wondered what the Pacific, I always wanted to know what the Pacific Islanders, what knowledge, you go through many examples of knowledge, of what knowledge might mean, and it was very clear that there was a deep problem in terms of the context of what was going to be exchanged exactly, and what an exchange was, for that matter. What is the nature of exchange as a relation, right? Which, of course, as a Melanesianist, you thought a lot about. But is there any sense of what the Pacific Islanders did think had been not returned in the way of obligations, particularly?
That's actually a very interesting comment, because you've brought in a dimension that I don't think anybody was particularly thinking of, which is that there might be common cause between the oceans. I'm afraid this was all a sort of one-way, we scholars need to debate about the Pacific. I also, in fact, I left out of the paper one or two comments that made me feel that, I feel that this is sort of academic life as usual. What do? You get together a consortium of scholars. But the truth, there is actually a little truth there, a little social truth, which is that the reason for those odd locations around the world were not to do with some kind of logic of environmentalism. They were to do with the logic of personal interactions of anthropologists who had worked and other people who had worked in the particular Pacific countries had particular obligations to particular academics in those countries, and there was this was a social network, and it happened to be that there were people based in, the two Pacific institutions, the University of the South Pacific and the Papua New Guinea National Research Institute, had a logic to them, but the only logic to the European institutions was the enthusiasm of the scholars who had the privilege of working in the Pacific and wanted to make some kind of return to that, and they brought in the EU. But the second half of your comment as to the nature of the exchange, I'm afraid business as usual doesn't get one very far. The knowledge exchange is one of those empty boxes. I mean, it's rhetoric, isn't it? That makes you feel that something has happened. And Corey behind you, of course, knows all about that. I'm not close enough to that particular body to know whether they'd got beyond just saying that one of our work packages is going to involve knowledge transfer. But I would imagine that what does happen is going to be intimately the result of the social obligations and relations between the particular individuals involved. But the question was spot on.
And then Corey?
Yeah, I just wanted to think about the relations of these.
A little more loud.
About the relations.
Very loud, please. Yeah.
I want to kind of throw a comment about the relations that you were kind of commenting about, and it's I kind of see this resistance of contradiction, because you're claiming that Donna Haraway is claiming that when you talk about relations, you are kind of saying that there are two separate entities that are pre-existing to the act of relating them.
No, the opposite.
Okay, so you're saying the opposite, that it's not. That's precisely the critique, that there is not two separate entities before the relation. So you are putting into question the very idea of relation, because relation, it seems implied this idea that there are two separate entities. But yet, when you display this image with the strings, when I look at the image and I see that there is kind of a chemistry or a link, I see that there is a link, but yet I see that there are two separate entities at the same time. So I kind of see the relation. So that's why I start saying that there is this resistance of contradiction, because I see both, that there are two separate entities, but at the same time, there are a relation, at least from this vision of probably this idea, this example of the strings, that I can see this link. But it's probably an optical illusion, I don't know. It's just, I'm just saying that there can survive those two ideas, one in which the relation is not, it's an expression of putting into relation, let me put it that way, two separate entities or more, but also there is an expression of two separate entities, if you will. Mm-hmm. So they are both surviving as a contradiction, but they are there, I think. So I find it very useful to think about the contradiction. That's what I want to say.
Could I comment briefly? If it's relatings all the way down and the partners are the product of relatings, there's a temporal dimension in this whole thing. And it's not two-dimensional, it's multi-dimensional, including and multi-scalar. So that multiple scales of time and space and lines going on in different relatings with different temporalities going on in various relations of temporality. Yes. Okay. That the relatings, it's not that, as a logical exercise, one could say, at one moment, it's like a Gestalt switch. At one moment, you've got separate entities entering into relation. when they do that, they produce something else that emerges out of the relating. So those partners are the product of that relating, but what went into that relating were prior products, etc. That idiom of production and transmission through that kind of line is, I think, very much in keeping with Marilyn's analysis of the relation. And what happens if one tries to queer that, radicalize it, do something odd with it in such a way that the building of good enough separations in order to get through the day, like having subjects or human rights, or the building of something good enough to get through the day, it is part of the ordinary doing of worlds, okay? But never do you actually get, philosophically speaking, a separate entity. You get partial connections. You get good enough entities. In Melanesian analogies, you might undo individuals. An agential act will, for a time, produce an individual along a certain line. But persons don't exist as individuals. They exist as individuals that can be undone through agency along a particular line. And it's done otherwise in Euroworld. Look at the comparison. Okay? And you get these interesting flicker worlds. I don't know how to take that any further. It's just that it's not contradiction, I think, is what I'm trying to say, but various kinds of frictions that then evoke something else. There's an elsewhere in these putting together. There's something otherwise that happens. It's not contradiction exactly, I think.
Donna has just demonstrated that she is considerably more than just good enough. I mean, that was incredible.
Marilyn is way too modest because she taught me everything about it.
I think you've just answered what I was going to try and say. But so, Marilyn, one of the things that I have learned from you is what happens when we take a term and make it go away, so that we can see what emerges in its name. And one of the things I learned from Donna is what happens when you explode a term and proliferate it tremendously, such that you don't quite know what it is. Exactly. So I'm trying, so having both of you do this around the question of relation together is just ridiculously wonderful. So thank you, both of you, for that. And I'm trying to, I'm grappling with the relation and relations, and the relationship between abstraction and specificity, or something like that. And Marilyn, one of the things that's so rich and so hard with your work is that one of the things that emerges in all of its specificity, right, in the name of these terms, is something like abstraction itself. Right, that abstraction becomes one of these specific things that we have to learn to think with or to deploy. And I just wondered if I could ask you the very flat-footed question as a way to help me understand the move in the paper. Is there in your paper an abstract relation, or are there only specific relations, or is that the wrong question?
No, that's a wonderful question. In another context, I do produce a particular specific form of abstraction, but I'll leave that to one side. I don't want to talk about that now, but I'll leave that to one side. I think the relation that takes on so many colours and does so many things and turns back and barks at us, which is what I almost wrote but then didn't. can take on an abstracted form, and I suspect I just simply slip in and out of moments when I abstract in the sense that I'm simply signaling the whole field that we might call relations or relationality or relationship or whatever, and by signaling simply create an abstraction so that I slip between that and then being very specific about how relations are being constructed at particular moments. But I suspect I'm not at all disciplined.
But there's an Alison, I mean, consider the ubiquitous capacity of relations to at once link whatever we want and uncover the way things are already linked, and then turn around and grin back at us, Alice in Wonderland, not Cayenne, my agility dog, and grin back at us, the Cheshire Cat, because it has assimilated everything to its form.
Yeah. Now
that's a critique. That's relation bad. That
I think is a description of the work that relation does in Euro-American knowledge making.
True enough.
And we cannot get out of it.
But that's the question.
But all right then.
Now you don't like that, do you? No, actually, this gets back to this question of critique.
Well, I'm sort of affectionate for it,
You and Lewis Carroll.
Look, maybe I should apologize to everybody because, I mean, exactly what you were talking about in the sense that, or that David commented on, that the academic process sets up certain expectations. And maybe the one way of being a little bit cosmopolitical is actually to do that because we can do nothing else. We set up certain expectations. But in fact, I don't mean the expectations that unfold. So I'm doing a critique because I still have the old-fashioned sense that one should understand, while at the same point realizing how situated. Oh, yeah. Of course. It's all there, Donna. It's there right at the beginning of the paper, because I quote you on situated knowledges.
Grinning like a Cheshire Cat all the while.
That's what this paper is about.
Yeah, it is. But you see, I like this about you. If I were to re-describe Marilyn Strathern, having recently read, say, Eduardo Cohn and learning about real jaguars and then spirit jaguars and real dogs and spirit dogs and the way the Avila Runa navigate the various complicated worlds they have to navigate, so forth. I would read that quote about grinning back at us because it has assimilated everything to its form as a form of eating up. That there is a Marilyn Strathern that describes relationality in such a way as to show the way it eats up the whole world and then turns around and grins at you as if that's the whole world. And you're frozen into it like the Medusa has frozen you in place. And that this, and furthermore, I agree with you, and this is a mode of critique, absolutely critical to understand how this works, and a mode of operating on the world that must be cut. That it does not deserve to continue to populate the cognitive operations of the planet. Okay? And it has to be stopped. And how? Now, who else is responsible for stopping it but those who know it so well that we dream it, who are constantly producing incredibly rich worlds out of these operations. People like me know how this works so well because we do it in our sleep. Okay? Who else knows better, maybe, just maybe, has a chance to figure out how to cut it? Not to stop, how to cut it in such a way as what? To release some of its capacities to do something other than grinning back at you with this totalitarian totality, that the power of Euro thinking, the power of the Euro. Well, what I'm not going to. That's it's sad. The power of these operations, these ways of worlding, to somehow do without that would be a little bit like those awful Protestants stripping all of the really neat stuff out of the Catholic churches and producing a ruin in favor of the Word. I can tell you how violated I felt when I stepped into my first Reformation churches in Europe. Stripped and raped. I feel that doing without the power of relational thinking would be an abstemiousness akin to lighting the fire before it combusts spontaneously. Okay? And that owning the capacities is really critical, and somehow stopping what I think is at stake in relational thinking is somehow figuring out it's the problem of systems theory, how to do systems without the system. It's a problem that repeats itself at every scale, and that folks who are native in these cognitive apparatuses have a special kind of obligation to figure out how to do something else with it. Something like that.
Yeah. I think Mario Plaza and Mario Viajoli.
My comment pretty much just what has been discussed. I mean, what I was thinking was what evoked for me Marilyn's presentation is a stoppage and a kind of warning that there are things that are not relations, that are not knowledge, that are not what, but not this. But not. And then I thought, okay, then what happened if we apply that warning to we are all lichens, which I take as a gloss of multi-species storytelling. So how do we tell stories, multi-species storytelling, in the presence of that which is not species?
Like lichens, who are not species.
Or not even lichens, or something else that we don't even can name it, because always we are bringing it back in a way to the form that incorporates everything, and stay with the trouble.
Okay, let me turn this completely around the other way, because if you thought, what can Euro-America do is what you're saying. How can we release this capacity? I mean, if one were to say, well, what do Euro-Americans do that is anything like the Siberian shadow or the American cyborg? Actually, I suspect that our vocabulary of relations and relationality is probably as near as we can get to some authentic grasp of the way the world is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But one does it by saying, what is specific to. Mm-hmm. Or what is situated, and I think one of the traps is that apart from critique, if I might say, Donna, that the no, it's okay. No, I don't have no. Wipe that out.
But it's okay to have said it.
Yes, it's okay to have said it. Yes, but now I'm taking it back. Because I was going to compare critique with your situatedness, but actually it's not, because your situatedness is a more generous concept, because your situatedness simply invites us to have knowledge of the way things
of something rather than everything.
The way things are located, yeah. Something rather than everything.
So Willerslev, the people that Willerslev was working with in Siberia were in a particularly fraught relationship with the Russian state and the Russian police.
Absolutely.
And in a particular fraught relationship with the women of the towns. And in a million particularly fraught relationships. And they were, among other things, multilingual, operating in multiple registers, including this particular mode of, you may as well call it animism, through which these recognitions and jumpings occurred. That seems really important. These people seem to be, these people have a situated worlding, a situated knowing that can be and was put into actual string figuring, actual conversation that is not capital C communication, okay? With a Danish anthropologist, with biologists who might be really interested in the question of the, species diversity of the circumpolar north, or with the, et cetera, that only through these kinds of specifyings is the possibility not of a harmonious conversation, but of actually interrupting each other in an interesting way made possible. That kind of reaching in and redoing without the fiction of restoration or equality or capital C communication. It's that risk. It seems to me that anthropologists are among the scholars who are, who most have been, historically speaking, willing to risk their own ontologies in order to try to figure out, in order to inhabit, in order what? Including to represent. And that need to somehow get on, that need to somehow connect through these is so urgent. That, something like that. I don't know how to finish sentences like that.
So I apologize for dropping the level of the conversation a few notches down.
You can raise your voice.
Okay, so at the end of your presentation, Marilyn, you stopped and you said, okay, let me go over this again. And I think I still didn't quite understand it after you went through it again. So my question might display my misunderstanding. So I thought one of the things you were trying to do was to talk about, on one side, certain forms of relations that are more based on some variation of identity, like what you presented as the brotherhood. So two individuals connected by one identical parent. To the shadows of the discussed by Alberto Corsin. So these relations with something that appears to be as far removed from identity as possible. So the question is that, as I was thinking about these examples you were giving, as well as the example that Donna brought up from your work about the funerary gift of the pig. So it seems like no matter how you flip it, the dominant register is analogy. Right? So, for instance, the case of the brotherhood, you have different individuals connected through identity, through their parents. Then you mentioned the brothers-in-law that are connected through a difference, but it's a difference that they share. Right? So there is an identity between the difference that makes the relations. Or in the case of the pig, of course the pig doesn't look like the bride. So the analogy is not between the pig and the bride, but it's about the fact that the bride is alive, the pig is alive, something was cut, right? And something different comes back. So again, there you have obvious difference, but what matters is the analogy, right? So the question is whether, no matter how you flip it, it could be that at the end, if you just do some legwork, you'll find a chain of analogy connecting these people discussed by Alberto Corsin and the shadow. So it looks like the discourse of relations, and I'm just thinking aloud, seems to be trapped in a register of identity. So even when there is difference, what matters is differences that can be analogized.
I think you've set me some homework. I think, I mean, that's an extremely interesting, interesting comment, and pointing to the. Maybe it's because simply in order to find different relations to talk about, I've been searching for relations that obviously have some kind of similarity. So I'm back to Euro-American formulations as usual. But I think I better go away and think about that. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Back there. No, back there. She was raising her hand before Joe. So go ahead.
It's a question of kind of.
But raise your voice, please.
Question goes a little bit along those lines to the analogy question and how to this discussion about how to think through relations as we do ethnography, as we do anthropology. And I had this question ready before I had come here because I've been thinking through a lot of my field data through your own, especially the work of Professor Strathern. And very quickly, the research is about technology transfer within a South-South cooperation frame between Brazil and Africa. And one of the things that I've observed in the field is that given this interface is one in which doesn't have a lot of this new relation, it's at an interface where there's not a lot of precedence for it. A lot of the work that people do on the ground is to create the context for that relation. And a lot of the work they do is precisely through drawing analogies between the two sides, so analogies between cultures, analogies between tropical environments, analogies between developmental paths, which are both seen as peripheral, etc. So far that's what they do, but I feel like the hope that's a work for something else, which would be to turn those analogical operations at the level of register of what I'm thinking about in terms of metaphor into metonymic kind of relation, meaning real exchange, mutually transformative kind of relations, because it's not there yet. And I don't know if there will ever be, because I don't have a crystal ball, but of course I'm drawing here on this basic organizational dualism in anthropology, which is already in James Fraser, but also in Levi-Strauss totemism, which would be metaphor, versus what Pedro Castro has called the dark side of the structuralist move, which would be sacrifice, which is already in Moas, and Viveros is in a way claiming to be taking up that thread with this perspectivism, so which has a metonymic kind of relationship. So I'm thinking if you have ever thought more about that in terms of how certain kinds of relations turn into relate to other kinds of relations or turn into them, like metaphor and metonymy and vice versa. Maybe you already did, and on your right, and then I just
I think all I would say is that the point with which you conclude really demands material to work on. That is, one would need to be in there in a stretch of ethnographic or other kind of material, and to be able to sort of demonstrate the differentiating effect that different kinds of relations have in relation to one another. So I think it's the response really could only be effective in the context of particular material. But thank you very much for making it. I'm getting tired, actually. I'm running out of steam.
I can't quite get this question. I can't quite I'm trying to, I guess what I've learned from Marilyn's work over and over again is how relations, how much is built into or seems to come along with as luggage with relation when it's used. But I keep also then thinking of, I think Donna pointed to this in her first comment back to Marilyn, about how like lots of biologists, they think there might be a relation going on, and then they're looking to see if it is and if it's at all like what they thought it would be. And sometimes they decide not, or other, right? Lichens are unclear. In other words, this kind of assimilative capacity of relation that is posed in that phrase, think again of the architecture of the known world. I'm interested in also the ways within the Western tradition of trying to think otherwise of the unknown world. And process philosophy, I'm really interested in you answering that question of that tradition of thinking relations different than the particular types of relations that you're obsessed with. Because I see fights, I don't know, or different ways of trying to engage the kind of ubiquitous relation that gathers up the world and looks back at us with the ones that put us at stake in the world precisely by saying, I may be, related or not, or that might be the wrong word altogether. So I don't know if I still can't quite pose this, but that's the terrain I'm interested in.
What's the terrain composed of? I mean.
My examples are also thinking with scientists as they try to do what they do, and as they run into problems. I mean, in geology right now, or previously around, trying to understand neurons, how often what they thought was a relation falls apart as they start to look closer at it. And so it's kind of like the counter-example to the one where we already know the relation is there because it's built into kind of our way of seeing the world. How can we put that capacity at stake? Is that enough? Or
Yes, but I think we'd probably need to turn to the biologist, because I would have thought with relations all the way down that you simply remedy one problem with another by another, don't you? I mean, you
do, but you come to a point. I think it was Bruno Latour who talked about laboratories as machines for making mistakes, interesting mistakes, as fast as possible. Setting up conditions to be wrong as often as possible in an interesting way. Call that a laboratory. And that it speeds up the making of mistakes so as to be able to build something that holds or recognize something that holds, that creating, discovering thing that you show so nicely. And that with this one, for example, there's that fun conversation that has Richard Dawkins, the bad guy, the neo-Darwinist, and Lynn Margulis, my hero, in debate with each other at Oxford. And it's a debate about this sort of stuff. And Richard Dawkins says, harumph, grump, grump. Everything that we need has already been done here. The mathematics, the evolutionary theory, the Ernst Mayrs run wild. And that, you've got populations, you've got genes, you can always get to a smallest entity. Even if it dissolves in your hands, you can finally get to a smallest entity and watch it competing with some other smallest entity to see who stays in the game. And so if you've got populations, you're going to have some way of dividing them up, and you've got a mechanism for change, and all of the change in the world can be explained this way. Why do you need all this symbiosis stuff? It just messes it up. Why do you need all this symbiogenesis? And Lynn is reputed to have said, because it's true. Because it happens to be the way the world works. It seems to me that scientists take the risk to make claims like that. it makes me continue to love them even after I've been kicked out of their church. That scientists make not just, that scientists take the risk to say it works like this, not like that. Let me show you. And that's really something incredibly precious that they call each other on. You can call people on that. So that in the United States these days, with its science-poor, evidence-poor culture, the ability to say it just ain't so is so precious and built into these. You can't do that without the duplex and all the rest of it, and the instrumentation and all the rest of it. The scientists are willing to say this, not that, at the end of the day.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it answers
some of it.
Half of the question.
Whoops.
Another point would be, in the way in which you kind of pose the West to these examples from the non-West, it looks as if the West doesn't have the same resource capacity. Or, there seems to be deficits on both sides. And first of all, I don't know enough about the non-West, but it seems like there are resources, I don't want to say like that, but other resources than the one that you talk about as the assimilative capacity. Like, I think that the relation you trace is there almost everywhere I look. And yet it also seems like there are other things too. And so the hetero histories, even though
Okay, I hear your question now. Sorry, I didn't hear it properly before, in the sense of understand. I think that's a very fair comment, and it's a comment that, of course, is made of the gender of the gift. And after writing the gender of the gift, I then turned around and wrote After Nature because I wanted to thicken the plot on the Euro-American side. I think in this case, I suppose, I'm adopting a rather naive position, which is that I'm dealing on the Euro-American side with a selection. I mean, it is very much a selection, but a selection of ideas that are quite hegemonic, and that in a sense they don't need other people to stand up and speak for them. It wouldn't be possible, of course, to have any. It wouldn't be possible to draw on. I think this is where I'm not naive. It wouldn't be possible to draw on the non-Euro-American examples if there weren't within Euro-American discourse the capacity to perceive things quite differently. So in a sense, it's a smokescreen to go outside Euro-America. One could have done it within. Yeah, I guess.
Some of it, but not all of it.
Well, not all of it. No, not all of it.
Not most of it.
Not all of it, but some, yeah, quite a lot of it.
We'll have time for one more question. And Harriet.
Yeah, I would like to pick up on the previous.
But you have to.
I would like to pick up on the previous replies and just press a little more on this notion that we had here on Euro-American and non-Euro-American, which is, of course, a little disturbing for everybody and indispensable too. So to Marilyn, I think it's very, very important to stay with this idea of the hegemonic and to try to press that in the Euro-American, whatever it is. But how do you both, how far does that reach into the Euro-American territory or person or experience? Is it a hegemony which we share in a particular setting like this one here? Or how would you sort of locate it?
Yeah, well, of course, it's an impossible category. I mean, it's an absurd category, Euro-American. And one reason I like it is because it draws attention to its own absurdity. I mean, hyphenating Euro and American like that.
I just call them Euros.
You just call them Euros. Well, I have thought for our transatlantic, transatlantic Euros. And in fact, one of the things that the whole notion of cosmopolitics might do is begin to think of other ways of thinking of that category, because it won't work as culture and it doesn't map on to particular sets of people. Where I would look, I hope I'm not answering your question, I probably misheard your question. But I mean, I would locate it in a kind of discourse that's informed by Enlightenment. Scientific thinking can be spoken by anyone, anywhere in the world, but the point is that discourse drags an awful lot of other stuff with it, assumptions of all kinds about behavior and so forth. Was that your question, in fact? Oh, it was sort of.
Yeah. So it's a question that you would locate.
Could you stand up?
Sure. Yeah. You would locate it within the hegemonic sort of scientific.
Well, that was an answer to a question, yes.
That's an answer. Yeah. Which begs other questions, but that's for later.
Well, yes, it is hegemonic in the sense that I think it runs through our educational system and our training as graduate students and lot of public discourse and so forth.
And I think that hegemonic in the sense that it's located in the lots of work that requires to continue to producing that kind of structure that makes it what we think, right? So located in the lots of work that it requires.
Yeah, and there are lots of mundane examples. One from the history of current feminism has to do with what happened to feminist thinking about the situation of growing babies inside bodies. And the way there was no way not to make that a choice discourse if one was to have any kind of legal standing, or for that matter, idiomatic standing. That it seems, I remember that feminist discourse around the questions of responsibility toward making or not making somebody else inside one, in oneself and with oneself, et cetera, was not fundamentally, I mean, it was many things. It was a freedom discourse. It was also a choice discourse. It was a zillion things, but hegemonically becomes reduced to pro-life, pro-choice. And there is no way to speak the matter. And there's no way to secure the rights. There's no, and in fact, the failure to secure the rights across the whole midsection of this country, et cetera. The hegemonic structuring of these cognitive apparatuses and idiomatic apparatuses is really fierce. The world really has been resourced hegemonically, relocating the tin and the, eucalyptus is all over California for a reason. I mean, it isn't just cognitive. It really is a worlding with these apparatuses of connection and of disconnection and reconnection that came equipped with that for whatever one wants to call it. The history of modern science is the history of these relocations. It's not just that. It's not only that. But boy, it's big.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you indeed.